Hello and welcome back to the shop, everybody. This week we are continuing where we left off. We are week 38 of 2022, September 19th to September 25th. And you can see right away we are back on this wiring panel. So what I'm doing there is I'm just marking out where I'm going to have these tabs on the panel, and I'm going to clamp down one of the tabs just for test fitting in the car. So with that tab clamped and the board roughly in place, what I did is I just marked on either side of where that tab's going to be on the dash bar so that I later know exactly where I want to weld onto the bar. And that's what I'm doing with the magnet. I'm just getting it set up. I'm getting the tab lined up between those two marks that I made on the bar, and I'm making sure that the tab is straight and vertical. It's not, kicked too much to the front or to the back or anything like that. And I'm just gonna get set up to tack weld the tab on. So I'm all set up and I'm ready to go, and when you've got a cage in a car, sometimes TIG welding is just so awkward. Like, look how I gotta kind of almost lay down in the car so that my foot can operate the pedal, and climbing in and out. It's not always fun. I mean, I enjoy welding and I enjoy working on the car, but sometimes these positions are just so awkward. It doesn't help that I'm really not in shape, but whatever. Yeah, I got the first tab tack welded in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to grab the panel, and I'm just going to clamp that panel onto that tab, and what I can do then is I can get the second tab marked onto the bar and get that tacked into place. Alright, so you can see now, I'm just getting that second tab tacked on. So when I remove the clamp and the plate, I've got 2 there. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a couple of more tacks each just to make sure it's real solid. I'm not going to do a full weld in case I decide to remove it. While I was doing this, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking if I need to put a 5-point belt and attach it to the dash bar, these tabs have to come out because they're directly behind the back seat and they will prevent me from putting seat belts in the car. So that's why I only tack these in. Yeah, now that I got those tacked in, I'm just going to clean up everything that I needed to use the welder. So put the foot pedal back on the stand, you know, get the torch on the stand, that's the ground clamp, and then just kind of turn off the gas and get it back into its storage location. Next up, I'm going to mark out on the plate where I need to drill holes so that I can screw through the front plate into those tabs. So on this plate you can see that I've scribed a couple of places for the holes, and I'm just going to drill them out. Since the holes are drilled, I'm going to remount the ECU and the fuse panel, and then I will get this installed in the car. I am so much happier with this than the plate that I had originally built that was going to go just kind of in the back seat. And now this allows me to put, you know, a sub or a stereo in the where the back seat used to be as well if I want. So yeah, I like this setup a lot more. Huge shout out to Race Status for the idea. And now I'm just going to plug in the ECU power wire and kind of figure out routing for it. You know, it seems like every time I go into the car and I start to do wiring, it seems like there's just a huge ball of wires that I need to untangle and reorganize, and it feels like 90% of wiring for me is just untangling and organizing stuff. And I think it really is. I mean, you can see in the videos, I do this a lot. Now, is there a better way I could do this? Probably. But part of the problem is this is the first car I've wired so there's just a lot of unknowns and redoing stuff. In one of my last videos, I mentioned that I was looking for a very specific connector on the harness, and that's for the windshield wipers, and there it is. So that is not the stock one that came out of this car. I actually got that on eBay. I don't even know if it works yet. It's untested, but that is the connector and the intermittent wiper module and the stock connector that would go out to the windshield wipers. So here I am just testing it and make sure it is the right connector and stuff. Looks like it is. At some point in time, somebody had spliced onto one of the wires with a little splice connector, so that'll have to get removed. I'll probably replace that wire entirely. But it works. I'll have to figure out a way to mount the box and run the wires for the wipers later. That's not as much a concern at this exact point in time. So you saw I pulled the center console out. Don't really need that right now. And right now, this pink wire, I'm running this to be my hot on crank. So in one of the previous videos, I mentioned it's very critical that you have a hot on crank wire, because what happens is on this ignition, maybe not all of them, but this one on the Fox body for certain, when you turn the key to the crank position, it no longer powers the two ignition wires. So you need this hot on crank wire to actually keep all of the devices that need power powered. So that's what I'm running right there with the pink wire. And I'm just verifying on my old ignition connector where I'm going to plug it in. since I've verified where I'm going to connect it, I'm going to strip the wire, terminate it with one of those Ford box female terminals, and I'm going to put it into the ignition switch. It's always important to label your wires so that you know what they are later on down the line. I've got more than one pink wire, more than one orange wire, so if I didn't label it, I would have to spend a bunch of time either following the wire or checking it with my multimeter to make sure I got the right wire. Just easier to label stuff. So those wires that I'm looking at there are the wires that go to the cruise control and the horn. So I'm just taking a brief look just to try and see if I can figure it out easily, what they are. It wasn't easy, so I'm just failing at putting the horn button back in because I had it upside down. I didn't realize the steering wheel was upside down, so I'm trying to put the horn button back in with the logo right side up, which is wrong because the wheel's upside down, so I should have the logo upside down, and finally figured that out and got it back in. Took a little bit too much time, but we got it figured out. If you ever wondered what was on the back of this hat, here is your chance to see, because that's all you're going to get for the next few seconds. Since I've added more wires to this bundle, I'm just taking zip ties and just tying the bundle together just to make sure that it flows with the general wiring, and there's enough length and all that good stuff. And it just keeps it a little bit tidier and gives me like the picture in my mind of what it's going to look like when it's all done. This right here is kind of the main set of wires going to the fuse panel. It's doing, the ignition, wipers, radio, most of the circuits in the car. There's a few other circuits I'm going to need to add, but this is the majority of them. So I'm just organizing them, tying them together. So, like when I cut the main Holly bundle going up to that firewall connector, doing these wires is kind of, once it's done, it's done. Unless I move the fuse box to another location where I can shorten all the wires up. I couldn't move the fuse box anymore to the outside, but it's time to start wiring this stuff. I gotta get out of my head and stop, thinking, oh, well, what if, just do it. Because 9 times out of 10, when I just start doing something, it ends up working out just fine. There is that 1 out of 10 times where it doesn't end up exactly as I want. But even those 1 out of 10 times, I at least did something. I got some progress, even if that's progress that I later undid because I didn't like it. At the end of the day, I cannot foresee every single situation or know about everything that I'm going to like or not like, so I need to just start doing more. I need to stop thinking about it. I just need to start. Like, that's my number one problem, is just starting. Usually as soon as I start, it's like, okay, go time, and work gets done and I make progress. But even in this video, you can see I've got like 20 minutes worth of me just like standing around procrastinating, thinking about what to do instead of just working. So what I'm doing here is I am running each wire up, running it to the connector, cutting it roughly where it needs to be, and then I am stripping the wire and I'm putting on an uninsulated terminal. And the reason why I'm doing an uninsulated terminal is I will come back later and I will put my own heat shrink over the terminal and the wire for some strain relief. The reason why I'm doing this is you can see on the fuse panel they use those, like, what they call insulated crimp connectors, and they're either yellow or blue or red. I just don't like the look of them. I think they look cheap. I would much rather have an uninsulated terminal that I crimp and then I heat shrink myself. I think it looks much cleaner, much nicer, and more professional. I suppose, I don't know, it just looks better to me. In the case of the terminal that I just did, there's 2 wires under there, so I have the uninsulated terminals facing opposite directions with their backs together. That is the way that Ron Francis recommends you do it. And you'll also notice that, it's kind of hard to tell, but like I skipped terminal 13 in this case. So why would I skip terminal 13? And the reason why I skipped that is Ron Francis expects you to wire everything in a very specific way. So I don't remember exactly, but just as an example, they want wire 13 to be where power goes to your starter solenoid terminal. So how does it get here? So what happens? So what you do is you run the solenoid wire from the starter back to terminal 13, and terminal 13 won't get any power. It's just a deadhead connection. And what you then do is, out of your ignition switch, when you have the ignition all rocked all the way forward, there's a wire that leaves the ignition switch. It's going to go to your neutral safety switch, which in this case is on the clutch pedal. So when the clutch pedal is pushed to the floor, it closes the switch, so power comes out of your ignition switch to one side of the neutral safety switch. When your clutch pedal is to the floor, it gets jumped to the other side, and then Ron Francis expects you to run a wire from that other side all the way back to terminal 13, and then from there, once power is applied, it would run out to your starter solenoid. Well, that's extra wiring and an extra step that I don't need. So what I've done is it comes out of the ignition switch, goes to the neutral safety switch, out of the other side of the neutral safety switch, it's running along the dash bar, and it's going to run right outside to the firewall connector that is on the passenger side that you've seen me install in one of the previous videos. So wiring, I could do it exactly like Ron Francis wants me to do, and that's, their only supported method. If I run into any issues with the wiring and I call their support and I say, hey, my car's not starting, they're going to say, okay, so you've got the wire running from here and it's going to, here, and then it goes to here. And if I go, well, actually, no, I've changed my setup, they can't help me. Luckily for me, I love wiring, and if I had to call Ron Francis to troubleshoot something, I would be highly surprised. The only thing that I might call them for is troubleshooting the fuse panel itself. For example, if a circuit wasn't getting power. But as far as, any of the wiring inside the car, any of the circuits, I'm pretty confident I can troubleshoot and do all of that on my own. You can see as I've been doing all this wiring, all of the wiring kind of comes up the main trunk and then like right angles off to its terminal, and we can see that this wire is so short that it can't really follow that same path. Don't know what I'm gonna do here. I'm gonna have to figure something out because that's gonna drive me nuts if that one wire is super short and just like cutting across the rest of them. wire 1 here is the ignition wire coming from the ignition switch, and then that pink wire is the hot on start or hot on crank wire. And these are slightly bigger wires. These are I think these are 12 gauge wires. So when I crimp this connector on here, you'll see I actually end up having to cut the sides off of it a little bit because the ring is so large it can't actually fit on the terminal block. So I'm trying to screw them in, but the rings are just so large that they just don't fit in there. So that's what I'm doing there. I'm just nipping the sides off a little bit, and then what happened is I cut it too short. I wasn't happy with it, so I'm cutting the connector off. I'll put another one on. Well, first I'm going to clip the sides just to make sure it's the size that I want it, and make sure it fits. You know, trim it down, make sure it fits, and then once I'm happy with it, I will re-crimp the wire. So the reason why this happened is, as I mentioned, it's like a 10 or 12 gauge wire, and then those are 6-ring terminals, which are pretty small. So finding a 10 or 12 gauge ring that would fit in there, you know, I'm sure some of the supplied terminals would work, but those are all the insulated ones. I could probably rip the insulation off, but I had these, so I'm using them. So there we have our kind of final product, and I was just taking some pictures of it. And now what I'm doing is I'm just going to organize these wires a little bit cleaner. I wasn't quite happy with how they were looking. So what I'm doing is I'm taking some smaller zip ties and I'm just zip tying the bundle together. And when I zip tie under the wire, it gives it kind of a nice bend. And I'm gonna redo any connections that are too long or just don't fit in nicely. Alright, so as you can see, I have, you know, cut most of the wires, re-crimped most of the wires, and that's because that one wire was just too short, right? So I ended up redoing the entire wiring for the fuse panel just so it, you know, looks nice, it's all consistent, all of the wires come into the fuse box at, you know, roughly the same angle, and I'm happy I redid it. If, you know, I had to go back and redo it a third time, I would absolutely do it just to make it nice and clean. Now, as I've mentioned before, this is a Ron Francis fuse panel, and it comes with a lot of these wires, you know, pre-length. So they give you enough wire that they think should be sufficient. Now, most of the time on these Fox bodies, the ignition or the fuse block is mounted under the steering column. So in a typical install scenario, there would have been more than enough wire. But since I'm mounting the fuse panel at the back of the car, I could have used a little bit more length on all of the wires. Now, if I contact Ron Francis, it's possible they can add, you know, 5 or 10 feet to each of the wires. But with the kit as I bought it, that wasn't an option. So, while I really like the fact that the Ron Francis has all of those wires, they're labeled for what they are, sometimes you run into a situation where on a custom car it's just not long enough, and it might be better to just like buy the fuse panel standalone and then run all of the wires on your own. Just lessons to learn for next time. And now here I am back to thinking and procrastinating, as I often do when I've done something and I'm not quite sure what I'm doing next. So on my car, I plan on having some switches just on the top bar there. And what those switches are going to do is activate fuel pump if I want, run the electric water pump if I want, run either of the electric fans if I want, turn on, you know, interior light. That may also be on my headlight switch. I haven't 100% decided yet. But yeah, so the reason why I want to be able to do some of this stuff is, let's say for some reason my car is overheating. I want to pull over, turn the engine off, but that will allow me to still run the water pump and the 2 fans, which will cause coolant to flow through the engine and flow through the radiator and get cooled. The fuel pump, if you know, for some reason I want to drain all of the fuel out of the tank, if I want to purge any of the lines, I can, you know, take a fitting off, just turn the fuel pump on manually, it'll kick on, do what it needs to do. So it's just kind of handy to have. Right now I'm just kind of planning out which wire color I want for what. So for example, you know, fan 1 for shits and giggles is yellow, fan 2 is white, water pump is blue. Yeah, I'm just figuring all that stuff out. Since I have a bunch of different wire gauges on this stand, and the spools are very close to the end of the support, I can't really see what gauge it is, so I just add some tape onto the stand and write which gauge is on which level, just to make it a little bit easier to see in the future. You've seen me do this a ton before. I'm just bundling the wires together. And that look right there is, god damn it, I forgot to add the power wire to this. So start undoing all the taping that I just did, and I'm gonna go into the car and grab the power wire. So not only am I adding a power wire, I'm also adding a ground wire. And the reason why I'm adding a ground wire is the switches that I've selected have an LED on them. So they need to have a ground so that when you turn the switch on, power goes out to the trigger for the relay, as well as turns the LED on. Now that I have all the wires I actually need in this bundle, let's go ahead and start taping it all up. Now that we have it taped up enough, let's chuck it in the car and let's start running it loosely into position. And you know me by now, as soon as I do one thing, I just stop and sit around and think and ponder and try and figure stuff out. And, well, I'm not going to stop doing that now. So I'm just starting to figure out what I need for wiring in my air conditioning. And so I'm reading the manual and trying to get the wiring schematic understood in my head. A lot of this job is just reading wiring diagrams, rereading the diagrams, and adapting what the manufacturer provides to what I actually need and want and am going to do. So on the air conditioning system, there's a dryer, and on that dryer it has what's called a trinary switch. Now, typically a trinary switch actually has two functions. You pass a power into it and you pass a ground into it. And what happens is, as long as there is not too much or too little pressure, it passes the power through to the air conditioning compressor clutch, which would allow your compressor to spin. The ground feed, what it does is, again, under the same circumstances, as long as the pressure is not too high or too low, you can actually trigger the ground of a relay in order to kick a fan on. So in this case, I'm only using the trinary switch for a single power in and out. So that's why I'm only running the yellow power wire up and the gray trigger wire back. Feels like there's always more reorganizing and just shuffling these wires about. So much of it. So much of it. And now we're just going to run the trinary switch wires just up the bundle and loosely into place. Gray wire here is going to come off of the relay, and this is what's going to go out to the compressor. So this is the wire that's going to run up into the engine bay and turn the AC compressor on. So this bag right here has all of the controls for the classic Auto Air heater box, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to run power. Like, this has a relay built in, so I just kind of need to figure all this stuff out. That right there goes in line of the heater hose coming into the box. It's going to regulate the flow of water, and you can see it's got just a super short lead going into the control box. And then, you know, I've got a bunch of other wiring. I think this is my power wire here. It's got a ground, it's got a fuse, and I don't need any of that. The reality is I already have a fuse panel, so I don't need that fuse. I'm gonna run this into my fuse box. Ground wires, gonna have my own ground lead. I don't need that. So I gotta try and figure this out. What I want to do is I actually want to contact Classic Auto Air and see if I can get some of these connectors unterminated. That way I can run a brand new power wire, I can run a brand new ground wire, and I can redo all of these connections as I need them done. Well, everyone, this pretty much brings us to the conclusion of this week's video. As always, if you stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.